Good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing fine and you're okay out there. Anyway, my name is Annalise Singgit. Me and my partner, Miss Baman, is tasked to discuss about literary theory post-colonialism. So I will discuss about the theory itself and its important points, and Miss Baman will discuss later an example of a literary text in post-colonialism. So, postcolonialism is the outlook and studies as responses to colonial subjugation of European or Western to third and fourth world that emerged in 70s. This designates the time after official colonial rule. During this time, when post-colonialism started, post-colonial thinkers creates their own forms of knowledge and their own discourse. This is the time where the colonized, the ones called subaltern, subordinate, non-white, non-Western subject, are given the voice to express what really happened in the past. Eyes are opened, mouths are not shut anymore. Post-colonialism doesn't only focus in one area. There are a lot of areas. Emphasis include the Indian subcontinent, Northern and Central Africa, and Southeast Asia. These regions were under the control of England, the United States, and France. And when it comes to literature and post-colonialism, it's always an interaction and reaction in colonial societies and the effects of colonial practices on literary productions. It also deals with literature written by citizens of colonial countries that portrays colonized people as its subject matter. There are three important main concepts in post-colonial theory: mimicry, hybridity, and Orientalism. Mimicry, according to Baba, it's the copying of the colonizing culture, behavior, manners, and values by the colonized. Right? It's this is where colonized adapt the culture of the colonizers. It is a sort of anti-colonial movement in literature that produce social political works, which can appear as a parody in literature. So examples, colonized mimic the language, clothing, and education of the colonizers. Another important term in post-colonialism is hybridity. So from the picture itself, we can infer what is hybridity all about. Hybridity often is a mixture of the colonized experience, and the colonial influence, and doesn't only focus in one area. It could be hybridity in culture, hybridity in religion, in language, in culture, in literature, and so on and so forth. According to Baba, it creates a liminal space between overlapping cultures, the ambivalent space of cutting edge of translation and negotiation. Hybridity brings up the idea that you might belong to many communities or culture at once, that you are not, or we are not, like Filipino, like alone. Like for example, a Filipino born in America, he or she really an American, or is she a Filipino but she was born in America? Something like that. And also in literature, by people who can't identify as belonging to one specific nation, challenges us to think about how we might organize our universities and our systems of knowledge so that we don't reproduce the narratives of nationhood and silence the voices which are excluded from those narratives. So we have to be, when it comes to literature in our universities, we need not focus on Chinese literature only, on American literature only, on Philippine literature only, something like that. We have to explore other literature, because it could be like sometimes there are literary texts or literary pieces that are not Chinese, for example. About Chinese, it's a Chinese literature, but it's not written by Chinese. It could be written by American. Or for example, there are history books from the Philippines, but it's not written by Filipinos. It's written by Americans. So that's an example of hybridity. Another example, and very important, and last, no, not example, but main point of post-colonialism is Orientalism. Edward Said on his book Orientalism, states that Orientalism is the project of European and or Western for having authority over the Orient and reconstruct in European thinking. In other words, it's the concept for dominating, manipulating, exploiting the Orient, and an interestedness in Orient world recorded in so many Western texts. So, okay. Orientalism also is a set of discursive practices, the forms of power or knowledge that Western Anglo-European cultures use to control a region of the globe. Orientalism, these are all the terms which are negative when compared to binary opposites. Orientalism are all the things that the West considers negative. Orientalism are all the things that have to be repressed. Orient becomes the place where body, evil, feminine all reside, and that's according to Western culture, that Orients are views on the idea of otherness. Okay, let's now move on to the methods of analysis of literature, of a literary text in postcolonialism. Okay, so these are only a few, and then Ms. Bauman will give her side also later. Historical aspect number one. So when reading a post-colonial literary text, you have to check the historical aspect. In this case, there's always the subject and the object of colonialism. Number two, we have to see the physical and physiological aspect. Is there oppression present in the text? Is there intimidation present in the text? Number three, ideological aspect. In whose perspective it is narrated, or in whose perspective is the text narrated? Is it the colonizer or colonized? And therefore, we have to check the gender aspect. Is it men as colonizer, women as colonized? And lastly, we have to see, or we have to check the cultural aspect of the text. Is there a domination of a certain culture present, which includes ethnicity, race, and religion? Okay, so we have to take note of these points in analyzing a post-colonial text. Or for further ideas, we have these thematic concerns in post-colonial theory. We have gender identity, mechanisms of control, power relations, nationality and identity, and so on and so forth. Conclusion. Post-colonial literary studies and post-colonial theory in general focus on what happens when the colonized culture starts to or insists on producing its own knowledge about itself, when the colonized starts to voice out, to choose, to speak what really happens in the past. That's all about post-colonialism. Thank you so much for listening. Let's now move on to Ms. Bauman's part, which is an example of a post-colonial literary text.